Very good to have you along. This is Roundtable. More and more countries are now lining up to complain that Russia is failing to fulfill its promise to give them millions of doses of its Sputnik V vaccine. What was seen as a clever soft power tool from Moscow to win support in poorer nations is now turning into something of an embarrassment. So what has gone wrong? Welcome to the programme. I'm David Foster. Were Russia's intentions as honourable as it maintains to get help to places where help was really needed? Or has a possible propaganda victory over the West simply gone spectacularly wrong? Iran made a deal with Russia to buy 60 million doses of Sputnik V, but has only received around 1 million shots. In Argentina, leaked emails revealed the government had warned Russia it was facing what it called a critical situation if Moscow continued to fall short of its delivery promises. While Guyana, Bolivia, Mexico, the Philippines, Ghana and Guatemala have also reported delays to promised supplies. The Russian direct investment funder said it is on track to produce 1.6 billion doses in 2021 through agreements with 25 manufacturing facilities in 14 different countries.
Publication in The Lancet today really shows that Sputnik V is the vaccine for the mankind.
But at home, Russia is struggling to vaccinate its own population. Case numbers have skyrocketed due to the Delta variant, and the daily reported number of deaths has reached new highs. Now that Russia's own citizens are taking up more of its vaccine supply, will its vaccine diplomacy strategy be forced into a dramatic change of course? I'm very pleased to be able to say that joining us on Roundtable out of Moscow, we have Andrey Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Then we see Vasily Vlassov, Professor at the Department of Healthcare Administration of Moscow's Higher School of Economics. He's currently in Tel Aviv, and in Oxford, Samuel Ramani, an international relations academic at Oxford University. Andrey, let me come to you first of all, since you happen to be in Moscow. The Kremlin centralized all production, did it not, so that it would look good, look like all of this came from the government, and that's gone terribly wrong.
I won't say that it got terribly wrong, because indeed we have a system when major economic decisions are made by the government, and only the government can mobilize resources and to make sure that private producers keep their schedules. So without a push from the Kremlin, without an engagement from the government, it is very difficult to imagine that private producers would accomplish a lot. So for the Russian system, that seems to be natural, though, of course, it has its own disadvantages, and sometimes we see these disadvantages quite clearly.
Vasily, let me come to you and ask you, what kind of promises did Russia make that it cannot fulfill at the moment?
I think that we may say that a significant part of the promises are kept, but not in full. Because the production of the most famous Sputnik vaccine is still low, especially its second component. And I think that the discrepancy between the promise and fulfillment is just a natural extension of the technical difficulties.
But if the Russian people, as we hear, are reluctant to be vaccinated in large numbers, then that might well indicate that there are a number of vaccines available to be sent overseas, so you promise that you will do so. And yet there are loads of countries saying nothing's arrived.
The vaccine hesitancy is quite widespread all around the world, and Russia probably not number one in this sense. About 50% of Russians do not worry a lot about the epidemic, and it is again very natural that they don't like to be vaccinated right now.
Okay, but if Russia was boasting about how effective its vaccine was, how quickly it could produce it, and not all of its own people want to have it, then surely there must be a surplus that could be sent overseas. And that hasn't happened. Country after country is saying, you promised it, you've let us down.
Sometimes the volume of vaccine exported was much higher than the volume used in country. So it is balanced between the fulfilling the international obligations and desire to vaccinate the population. Right now, about 20% of Russians is vaccinated. It is negligible in sense of protecting from the wave of the epidemic. But right now we see that the summer wave is declining and not because of vaccination.
Andrey, I know you want to say something at this particular moment, or have I got that right or wrong?
I think that you are right. Indeed, right now Russia produces about 1 million shots of vaccines a day, and it definitely creates a surplus. Moreover, the Russian government maintains that in 3 months from now they can produce about 1.5 million shots of vaccine a day. So I think that there might be some bureaucratic red tape and procrastinations which are not caused by the physical shortage of vaccines. But of course, whatever Russia can do is likely to be a drop in the bucket in terms of the demand. The global demand on vaccines is much higher than any country can deliver, Russia including. So I think in many cases, Russia would prefer to move the production of vaccines overseas. For example, to produce Russian vaccines in India or in Latin America or in the Middle East directly closer to end consumers of vaccines.
Okay. Excuse me, Samuel, this, though, is a problem, isn't it? Russia's made promises. The countries believe what Russia said it was going to be able to do. And now those countries are saying, hang on a second. We're not sure we want you to do this because we've been waiting too long. We need to look elsewhere.
Well, I think that what happened was that in the United States and Europe, there was a lot of discussion about this vaccine diplomacy competition. So people like Jen Psaki or Emmanuel Macron would talk about, oh, Russia and China are getting ahead of the United States or France. And the Russians always in their media discourse and their official discourse tended to play that down. But Russia did really see an opportunity to get a first mover advantage when the Americans and the Europeans were preoccupied with their own pandemic. And in the process of trying to secure that first mover advantage, I think they overpromised. For example, they promised 300 million doses to the African Union. They promised 20 million doses to Egypt, 8 million doses to Guatemala, etc. And now they base those promises on several faulty premises.
Well, let's hear right now from the president of Guatemala. This is Alejandro Diametti, who said,
El 50% que se tenía previsto.
The 50% that was planned to be spent on Sputnik vaccines. As that commitment has been released for this year, we will be investing that amount in the negotiations that are already underway with other pharmaceutical companies, specifically Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer and Moderna.
Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer and Moderna.
Samuel, coming back to you, he says, look, we're going to have to look elsewhere. And the shame about this is that in the past, Russia has had a very good reputation in parts of Africa, in parts of the developed world, for helping to solve some health problems.
Well, absolutely. I mean, even in Ethiopia, for example, they still recall the deployment of Russian doctors during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. I mean, in much of the global south, there's a lot of admiration for the Soviet Union's efforts to eradicate smallpox and polio and other epidemiological achievements, as well as their recent Ebola vaccines that were given out in Guinea, for example. So, and moreover, Russia stakes itself, at least internationally, some of its soft power on being a more reliable and consistent partner to its allies in crisis, whether that's militarily in Syria or in other ways in the United States and the West. So this, I think, undercuts their reputation as a public health provider, but more importantly, the reputation as being this reliable crisis-proof partner that they've championed over the past decade or two.
So where do you think it went wrong if Russia was too boastful? Where did it make a mistake here?
Well, I think it went wrong with regards to their overestimation of local production capacity. And also there was some reservation, at least if you listen to some of the testimonies of Egyptian doctors, the Russians didn't give all of the scientific know-how to these countries in advance in order to produce them. So there's a bit of a miscalculation on how much existing medical know-how there was in some of these countries. And also there were issues of costs as well. Like the Sputnik dose in Africa was being charged at $9 a dose. Pfizer was coming at $3, and they figured that they would be able to recoup those profits quite easily, but I think there was a miscalculation there too.
Well, this is something I was going to bring up anyway. So you say that the cost of Sputnik is 3 times that of Pfizer. Andrey, I've got you down here as saying it's quite cheap to produce. That's one of its great advantages. Which one of you's right?
Well, this is absolutely right. The Russian authorities argue that they do not want to make any money on the vaccine, and they basically would like to just cover their expenses. And this is supposed to be the major advantage of the state-managed program. However, of course, the price of vaccine might reflect certain imperfections in the production process, and some nations are hesitant because they consider that the vaccine is simply too cheap to be good, and that might create a problem for Russia trying to deliver vaccines to the global south.
Vasily, you want to come in?
I think that the reasoning that it is too cheap to be good is quite correct in general, but the people, I think that it is quite clear for people around the world that Russia has real problems with the production of the second component. Russia can deliver in a big volume the second component of the vaccine. It is actually the symptom of failure. And next is that Russia started...
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there because I'd like you to be clear on this. Are you saying that Russia will not be able to produce the second batch of the vaccine, that it will not be able to deliver at all?
I think that just the volume of production of the second component is low. Recently, it was reported that in Korea, the company agreed to produce Sputnik vaccine, but only the first component. So probably there are some problems with the transfer of technology too. May I attract your attention to the probably side element, but important for the international communication about the Russian vaccine. In March, European Medicinal Agency started the rolling review of documents. And now it is August, and still the full set of documents is not provided to EMA from Russia. So actually, there is no formal application for the use in Europe. And it is unprecedented delay. Everybody can think that there is something wrong with the vaccine if producer cannot produce the documentation during half a year.
Samuel, what do you think? Would it have been possible, feasible for a country such as Russia, for the Kremlin, to have got this right without going for this soft power, this we want to get one over the West, we want to prove that we are the best, we want to get soft power? Would it have been possible in the Kremlin psyche to have done that? Would that have saved lives, maybe?
Well, I think that what would have been possible was that Sputnik was indeed the first vaccine that came out, and it did have a lot of disinformation, a lot of pushback from Western countries against it because it was originating from Russia. Maybe it's not so credible. And then the Lancet and scientific journals and other studies seem to vindicate its efficacy. So what the Russians should have done is they should have been maybe a bit more selective and been more thorough in their examination of where local production was possible. Like, for example, in Africa, they started with Morocco, then they moved to Tunisia, then they moved to Egypt, then they moved to Nigeria. They kept moving from country to country, making promises without really thoroughly looking at the local production capabilities of those countries. So I think that that was one thing that they could have done. The second thing they could have done is try to rein in some of the other players like Emirati middlemen or local dealers in these countries in Africa, which are inflating the price of the Russian vaccine and making Russia look like a price gouger. So maybe a bit more policing or a bit more hovering over of the distribution of these vaccines would have been helpful. And third, it probably would have been advisable not to have made such brash targets like 300 million doses to the African Union or vaccine cooperation all across the global south when China was not really willing to pitch in and other BRICS countries were skeptical, and set more moderate and more incremental targets. I think that would have made it a lot better for Russia.
Okay, Andrey, your thoughts on whether Russia overpromised because it was confident that it could deliver and then unfortunately it couldn't, or whether it overpromised because that is the sort of thing you do if you're in a propaganda war. You say, we are the best, we can do this. And in the end, it's the people that suffer.
No, I think that there was a hype. And of course, there was a clear intention to demonstrate that we can do it and we can do it first. And we will show that we are more generous than our Western counterparts and our adversaries. And definitely that created some negative side effects. But still, I would venture to say that the deficit of vaccines in places like Africa is huge. So I think that many African nations will still be interested in exploring opportunities with Russia. And indeed, maybe the local production capacity will gradually grow because the pandemic is not likely to end this year or even next year. So the game is not over.
So you have the international United Nations-backed scheme called COVAX, which is designed there to distribute the vaccines. Do you think, Vasily, that eventually Russia will find that it has to join COVAX rather than trying to lead this pioneering path that it wanted to make in the first place through the jungle of COVID?
I am very sorry that Russia yet did not join the COVAX. But actually, yesterday in the news connected to WHO, official Russia start to negotiate the participation in the COVAX or something like that. I think that it will be good because the demand for the vaccine internationally is so high that it is very natural, very productive to join the international efforts. We know that it is not without the problems, but anyway, it is very good if Russia will join COVAX.
Well, we've got a few technical issues. We've heard from Andrey, but we've lost his connection. We shall continue with you two gentlemen, as we can see now. So, Samuel, let me come to you now. Will COVAX end up being the only game in town? Will Russia have to join, or will its pride be so hurt that it stands off and ends up not being able to deliver what it wanted to if its motives were altruistic?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that Andrew was correct that many countries, particularly in Africa, are still going to be looking towards vaccine cooperation with Russia. And when you also look at the trials that are being done by Sputnik Light, which is their new one-shot dose, whether it be in Venezuela, whether it be in the post-Soviet space, and much of the global south, there's real demand for that. So I think that Russia can still stand alone as an independent vaccine distributor, even though in the Guatemalan case may be more of an outlier than a precedent. But I think that it would probably benefit by having one foot in COVAX, where it can kind of be seen as constructively contributing to the vaccine shortages in the global south, and one foot outside of COVAX, where it maintains its independent exports, and hopefully, over time, as the fall and winter rolls around, the local production issues start to dissipate, and they can really gain momentum. If the president of Egypt suggests that, maybe by the fall, there'll actually be some traction over there towards their 20 million pledged doses.
While we're looking at whether the program in Russia has worked or not, and whether the vaccine can be produced and got out there, we must also look at the other side, which is that this was designed, some have suggested, as a means to promote Russia in a very good light in certain countries and thereby gain a particular advantage over the West. First of all, do you think, Samuel, that ever works? And secondly, if it is the intention of the Russians to do this, has it completely gone wrong?
So I think if you look at the history of medical diplomacy, is that it can definitely work in terms of building memory. For example, Obviously, the Soviet relationship with Ethiopia is very checkered because of their role in the famine and the military interventions in support of the Derg during the Eritrean secession, but also the memory of Russian doctors and Russian famine relief and consistent Soviet medical support has neutralized some of that. So that shows that it can work, but also the example of the United States, where there's been extensive distribution of HIV/AIDS assistance and medical assistance over the past few decades, but as soft powers continue to lag China, suggests that it's not foolproof. So vaccine and medical diplomacy can sometimes work, but sometimes it doesn't work. I think in the case of Sputnik V and this case, the fact that it's challenged Russia's reliability as a crisis-proof partner means that it's going to be very difficult for Russia to recover from here in the image war. And also, there's also set negative impressions of Russia in Latin America, in Africa, because of the activity of the Wagner Group and some of their other support for authoritarian regimes, that just distributing shots won't take over. So I think it'd be more like the American example than the Soviet example.
Okay, you can come back on this one, Samuel, if you like, but I'll go to Vasily on this one. So Samuel's suggesting that the antipathy towards Russia, if its program fails, it could be quite long-lasting. I would suggest that if you're somebody who's getting a vaccine or you're getting other medical attention from the Russians, you're going to be very grateful and your memory will be rather short if you get better.
Russia is trying to provide a better image around.
But will its image have been hurt by this? But my feeling is that people's memories are short. As long as they get better, as long as they get the help, they will forget what may have gone wrong this time, that it hasn't really hurt the Russians in the long run.
Oh, sure, memory is short. But, you know, if at some point there is a favorable influence, in this specific day, the new relationship, new trades, new agreements may be built on that. So it is why all this game is played. So I think that the attention to the influence, the international affairs by vaccine in Kremlin now is very serious, as serious as never been for last probably 40 years.
I'm so sorry. I thought you'd stop for a second. If we are to take four major economic powers, that be Russia, United States, China, and the European Union. Obviously, the European Union is not one country, but it is an economic bloc that tries to gain advantage. Do you think any one of those four blocs has actually done well and enhanced its reputation with vaccine diplomacy?
I believe that Kremlin tend to play the game of asymmetric response. They use the arm they have. They have now vaccine, and they promote it and provide it and participate in any agreements, in any interaction where the major role of Russia will be visible.
Okay, Samuel, if anyone has been trying to get an advantage over the other, has one particular group managed to succeed when it comes to medical diplomacy of the four that I mentioned?
I think that in terms of great powers, there's very few success stories with regards to vaccine and medical diplomacy. I mean, the United States and Europe were severely undermined by the severity of the COVID-19 pandemics in their own country, which basically undermined their quality of the healthcare system and raised doubts about their global leadership. China has been marred by efficacy concerns, particularly with regards to where it's been used, like Seychelles and Dubai, as well as the opacity of their initial response. Russia has been undermined by the pandemic at home, as well as the distribution efforts abroad. The real winners have been the second tier of powers, like India and Japan, and the middle powers, not really the great powers.
And the real winner might be those countries that eventually find that the patent waivers have gone away. They can produce their own vaccines and they're not reliant on other people, I suppose, Samuel.
Absolutely. And I think that, if there's one thing that Russia achieved with the Sputnik V is that it showed that it can produce technologically cutting-edge medical achievements. So it really restored maybe some faith in Russian technology, but that didn't extend to medical and vaccine diplomacy.
Thank you both very much indeed, Vasily. Thank you, Daniel. And we thank in his absence Andrey Kortunov, who was joining us from Moscow, but who we lost for technical reasons. Listen, thank you very much indeed, and thank you wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable. Plenty more on our YouTube channel. I'm sure you know how to find it, but for now, from me, David Foster, it's goodbye.